Good afternoon, everyone. I'm AJ, Manager of Rural Events here at Groundswell, and I am so glad that you're joining us as we kick off our 2025 Rural Renaissance webinar series. This year, we're diving into how local leaders are strengthening the resilience of their communities through forward-thinking planning and community-based partnerships. Before we jump in, I am so excited to announce that pre-registration is now open for the 2025 Rural Renaissance Roadshow. We'll be gathering in Opelika, Alabama this November 10th, 11th, and 12th for 2.5 days of conversations like today's, field trips to see local economic development and resilience projects, delicious food, live music, and of course, great company. Reserve your spot today at ruralrenaissance.com. If you joined us at last year's roadshow, you might remember Councilman Jayceey Sebastian and Groundswell's Wesley Williams, who are back on our stage today, along with Brooke Williams, Principal Engineer at Southern Company, and Mandy Mahoney, CEO of MahoneyOne. Mandy is an incredible leader who's also served at the U.S. Department of Energy as president of the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance, and she was the first director of sustainability for the city of Atlanta. We are so grateful to have Mandy joining us as guest host. If you have any questions during the webinar, please drop them in the chat and we will answer as many as possible. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mandy. Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all, and welcome. We are thrilled to be with you today and appreciate Groundswell organizing this very important and timely conversation. As I think about resilience, it hit home for me personally when Hurricane Helene went through our state. I live in Atlanta, and my son and I were hunkered down, expecting the storm to come through. But when we woke up the next morning, in fact, it had changed course and went through Augusta, where my widowed Aunt Jayceey lives. And she had not prepared for it because it wasn't projected to go there. But she woke up with 2 giant pine trees that had fallen down. Luckily, they'd spared her house, but she didn't have electricity. And she was quite bewildered and didn't know what to do. And so my sister and my brother-in-law and my husband and I were all scurrying to try to help Aunt Jayceey. And that went on for a couple weeks. And we are thankful that she's in good health, but I think if she hadn't been, and if she would have needed, she'd been diabetic or dependent on oxygen, that we would have been in a really awful situation. And so there are many people like my Aunt Jayceey, and thankfully the people on this call are already working to address those issues and are going to talk to you about real things that are happening in the South right now to help our community. And so I am really excited to introduce to you first Wesley Williams, who is a Senior Vice President of Community Development, Marketing, and Communications at Groundswell. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, ma'am.
Jayceey Sebastian, who is council member of City of South Fulton, as well as an elder of the Community Church of God at the Vickers Community Church. We're going to be hearing about some really exciting work that has happened at Vickers. And then Brooke Williams, Principal Engineer at Southern Company, who's going to speak to why this is so important to Southern Company and Georgia Power and their other operating companies, and what they're doing to that to work with people like those we see here on the call. So welcome all of you. And I would now like to ask each of you to, in your own words, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why this is so important to you.
Thank you, Mandy. Again, my name is Wesley Williams, SVP at Groundswell. And Groundswell, as many of us know, is a nonprofit that builds community power, doing community development through clean energy to make sure that we're able to cut the energy bills of our neighbors who need it most in half, but then also increase resilience for everybody through local projects that invest in local communities. And I'm excited about this conversation for a couple reasons. One, when we're talking about resilience by design, I think it underscores the fact that the environments that we live in are manifestations of the agreements that we make, right? They are by design. And we can design a better future that enables abundance for all. And for me, a future that reflects, for me, what are deeply held values, that are faith-rooted values. And this is a conversation that gives me an opportunity to talk about how we love our neighbors as ourselves and make sure that all folks are able to live with abundance, right, and live abundant lives. And so I'm excited about this conversation. I'm excited about this work. And I also get to be in this conversation with great folks. And so that's no doubt an added plus. Thanks, Mandy. Wonderful.
Councilmember and Elder?
Thank you, Mandy. Well, for me, I'll tell you, it's been many, many years of this conversation, even before I met the wonderful people at Groundswell, and even before we started the project at Vickers, and even before I was a council member. Because years ago seemed like another lifetime when I got involved in climate change research. In my other life, we knew that some of the things that we're seeing now were coming. And, some of us were trying to raise the flags several decades ago. And I'm truly happy to be now involved in the implementation stage, which is resilience. And as Matthew mentioned, by design. Part of my work obviously centers around the church, which I was happy to see that some of the people are saying we go to church when we need to feel safe and protected, right? Also, as an elected official and policymaker, I now also get to discuss this on a wider level. How do we tackle this whole issue of resilience by design, right? How do we prepare our community better so that your aunt doesn't get caught off guard, right? Mm-hmm. And how do we build systems around our cities so that we can have resiliency throughout the city? And again, for us, being the second largest city in Fulton County and the newest one in the entire city, it's a good place to be because we're at the starting point of a lot of things.
Thank you. Brooke. We cannot hear you.
Okay, let's try again.
We can hear you.
Great. Brooke Williams. I work for Southern Company, and I am here to talk about the work we do. My work is centered and focused on advancing energy affordability and energy security. And that's important to me because of all the opportunities I've had throughout my 16 years with Southern Company to meet face-to-face with customers during when they need service, when there's a storm and we're trying to restore service, in all the ways that I've had opportunities to meet with customers face-to-face to understand the role energy plays and them meeting their needs and being resilient during those storm restoration efforts.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, let us now move into our questions. And Matthew, we'll start with you. Would you help us just ground what we're talking about? Let's define some terms. What's resilience? What's a resilience hub? Just help us with that.
Sure. So, we think and talk about it in terms of community resilience, right? And I think about resilience in terms of what it takes to create the conditions for a community to flourish, to thrive, which then enables them to withstand a storm, recover from emergencies, and to address disruptions, right? And so when I think about community resilience, I think about two things. One has to do with access to critical resources and infrastructure, and the other has to do with participation in community. And we can't, neither of them are less important than the other, right? They really do run hand in hand. And those two things taken together help to foster the conditions for community resilience, which often gets reduced to emergency preparedness or recovery after a severe weather event. But again, resilience has everything to do with the conditions that were in place prior to the storm. And so, resilience hubs are those trusted places in the community that many of the audience members name: churches, community centers, parks, often anchor institutions that help facilitate access to those resources, access to infrastructure, access to community. And so, resilience hubs, they look different, serve different purposes in different communities. What typically is one standard across different resilience hubs is a source of energy. We do solar plus battery storage to ensure that in the worst cases of power disruptions, emergency, severe weather, that if the lights go out in the community, the power's still on at this trusted institution or center, so that folks have access to what they need to be able to power devices, oxygen concentrators, store medicine and food. And so in a real sense, that's what happens in and post an emergency, but in an ongoing way, those community resilience hubs are ongoing resources for communities, which is why they're trusted, right? It's not a field of dreams. It's not a thing where you build it and they will come. Mm-hmm. They are already doing the work. Folks are already coming, and they're an ongoing resource for community in everyday times. But then they're also a place of refuge in storms and emergencies. And then post storms and emergencies, they become an engine for recovery. That's essentially what we mean when we talk about a community resilience hub.
That is so helpful. Thank you. Brooke, there's a lot of talk here in Georgia and nationwide about resilience hubs. Can you help us understand why it's important to your work at Southern Company?
Can you hear me? Great. Okay, so unfortunately, in our service territory, we experience a lot of large major weather events. And so it's a reality that we have to face to make sure that the communities have, that they're resilient through those outages. And so learning in each weather event, you learn what that role is. And the contingency planning becomes, we plan for contingency, but we're learning how we can play a role in communities for that contingency planning in those events. And one of the things that has come to light for us as we've dug in is to realize that it's not even about just the ability for that different communities have different abilities to adapt in those scenarios. And so some of our lowest income communities have fewer resources to adapt in those scenarios, and figuring out what our role is in supporting those communities. There's also understanding the infrastructure and the role it plays to ride out those events. And so there is a difference in infrastructure when you look at building codes and the different regions within our service territory and the quality of the energy efficiency of those buildings in those events. So it's not even just for the individual houses, but also for the community locations that people gather. So those play into affordability and resilience through those events.
That is really helpful insights. And Jayceey, as we've heard from Matthew and Brooke about what they're doing, you're living this. This week marks the first year since the groundbreaking of the Vickers Community Resilience Hub that you worked with Groundswell to build at your church, the Community Church of God. That church is the first project completed, the first community-owned resilience hub here in the state of Georgia. So congratulations.
Thank you.
But would you tell us a bit about why the church said yes to building this landmark project and how it came to be located at Vickers?
Well, you know, the thing about community church is that we have always been that little church that the community looks to. And Matthew described some of those things perfectly. When the community is in trouble, they look to Vickers. We have a major food pantry that operates every single week where we feed between 300 to 400, sometimes even 450 families. And so we make the Vickers building available for folks for when they have like baby christenings, if they need to do an unfortunate thing where there's someone who dies and they need to have a repast. The Vickers building has always been known in the community for that. As a matter of fact, the Vickers building is known better in the community than the church, right? That is just next door. So, you know, many times I'm describing where the church is and I said, do you know the Vickers community building? And they would say, yeah, well, it's the church next door. So I say all of that to say when the opportunity came up for this cistern to be built, the community actually helped to identify Vickers. The community answered that question, go to Vickers. Where do you go in times of trouble or where you have needs or celebration? And they said to the Vickers Center, right? And so it was a natural fit. And all those things that we do as a small church, and we host the NPUs without cost. We do things for like the Concerned Black Clergy of Atlanta, they meet there. So even as the system was being built, it was getting exposure even to a lot of different churches in the neighborhood, just because even the Concerned Black Clergy meets there. But to Brooke's point, even on the other hand of this, helping seniors to relieve their energy burden, part of what we do as a ministry, we have a fund where we help citizens with their energy burden when they're facing those times where they can't make those bills. And so for us, it's more work and more education that we can give to the community and to be prepared to help them in their times of need, which is part of our ministry anyway.
Outstanding. And just so inspiring. So Matthew, y'all have been in partnership with them doing this. And it's just core part of Groundswell's work, is my understanding. But can you tell us a little bit more about y'all's approach to community resilience? How do you balance community vision with the technical and financial feasibility of these projects? Absolutely.
Balance is a great word. And in some cases, counterbalance, right? They're always in conversation with one another. And it's balance between not just community vision, but community-based research that helps to drive data and decision-making, which then pairs with the technical expertise and guidance that's needed from a local utility, right? Like Georgia Power, to help us to troubleshoot, to cite, to interconnect, and to meet with the technical requirements that are necessary to get these projects off the ground. Then there's also the municipality, right? There's the city, which has economic and community development priorities. The city will also have and does also have emergency preparedness and response systems. And so tying those pieces in are very important. And then finally, you mentioned the financials. Groundswell's mission, again, is to build community power. And for us, community ownership is a part of that power, right? And so we work really, really hard to ensure that we can build a financial stack and model that delivers community ownership. And this was a case, Vickers is a prime example of a case in which actually the direct pay provision in the IRA, which enables nonprofits, churches, schools to benefit from tax credits related to these projects. It made community ownership possible in this case. And so the creative stacking of funding and financing and tax credits. And in some cases, if it's possible, local community, taking on some financing as needed, like that creative stack, which gets kind of customized to the situation, makes all of this possible. But I can't underscore how important it is to start with the community, which for us enables us first to define what resilience means, right? What it requires, which then drives the design of the project, including the financial stack. So all of those pieces really do tie in together, and you really can't have one without the other.
And if I may add something here to what Matthew has just said, because for community church, this was such a crucial piece, that financial stack. Because if we had to do it, because remember I keep saying that we're a small church, if we had to do it without the creative financial stack that was presented to us, we probably would not be able to do it as much as it deserves being where it is now, right? So one of the things that we really need to do whenever we're establishing some of these other sites is to really get creative and know how you can get support to make sure that that service and that protection is providing in places where it should be, even if there's the financial challenge involved. And Groundswell was a great partner from the onset and really held our hands through this initial process. And if I don't get a chance to mention it, we took the ownership option rather than the lease option as well, right? And it was mainly because for the church, the cost option would, if any, would be really on the back end. It was not on the front end at all. And we would be able to roll some of the savings that we see, which I recommended, into a special account, so that if we have to do anything on the back end, we'll be able to have at least some funds to be able to help with that. As well as using some of that fund, if possible, to help build out further programming, because we now have a center that is more exposed to the community. We can get more involved in workforce development programs, for example, and additional training opportunities for the community.
That's so cool. Thank you for helping us understand that connection. And Brooke, over to you. Energy affordability is a core concern for you in your work. How might resilience hubs be designed and deployed to help address the issues of affordability?
Again, how about now? These fancy mics that are adapting to, reduce background noise. Okay, so one of the exciting parts of the work right now for me is the opportunity to engage in different communities to find out what resilience means in that community. And so we see things that have been mentioned today about, resilience when it comes to storm outages and having access to refrigeration for critical medications or the ability to charge medical equipment. But we also see some really exciting opportunities, to the point that Councilman Jayceey just pointed out, about workforce and building some economic opportunity in these communities that then also has residual outcomes to bring more resilience in that community. And so increasing awareness around different workforce opportunities, using it as a hub for those education opportunities. That's a really exciting part of the work for me, and the ability to connect with people to better understand how we can serve in those communities.
Super. Thank you. And back to you, council member. This question asks you to wear both hats. One as the elder of the Community Church of God, and the second as council member, also former mayor pro tempore for the city of South Fulton. What does long-term success for a community resilience hub look like, both for a hub serving local community and for a city like South Fulton that is building its own clean energy and resilience plan?
Great question. Thank you. Well, for Vickers, I can tell you success for us is going to be when that center not only is capable of being a resiliency hub in an emergency situation, but then it becomes either further center of that community. And by that I mean, regular job programs, regular workforce development programs, the community would know and would feel comfortable in bringing their own programs even to the city that we can partner with, even to the center that we can partner with, so that in the event that we are, as a church, would go away for whatever reason, I hope not, but there's always a possibility, right? Church closes sometimes, but it will still remain that place in the community and become truly community owned. So when we talk about community owned, and Pastor Dr. Kevin Early oftentimes say we're pastoring the community, that's what that center becomes for us. The major tool in which we can pastor the community and really take care of the needs that people may have on an everyday basis. If it's employment is an issue, then we can, have those workforce development programs or training programs. We are sometimes host things like job fair, where people again look to us as a community. And again, the more we're able to cut some of the energy burden on the church itself, is the more we can utilize the facility. As a council member, I tell you, it's almost everything in every facet. Everything that we're doing now, the building codes issue was mentioned a while ago. It is a conversation that we're having right now, because you're right, Mandy. Hurricane Helene was supposed to come on this side of town, and I can tell you, if it did, we would have been so badly affected because we are so forested in the city of South Fulton, right? And I know, we have streams and rivers that come through here. We did have some local washouts and so on and so forth. But how do we then educate our citizens? And how do we have conversations around infrastructure improvements, building improvements, educate our communities and our business base, our business partners, as to how they build resiliency into their everyday lives and their everyday operations? I was on a call yesterday about a particular development, and one of the questions I asked the folks is, what is your resiliency plan? In other words, if you're building hundreds of homes and putting them in a relatively small 66-acre area, how do you then make sure that if something happened adversely and in the community, whether naturally made or man-made, right? How do the residents there survive? City of South Fulton is 90 square miles. And so how do we make sure we come up with a plan to build resiliency across the entire 90 square miles of the city? We have a lot of green initiatives going already in pieces, and we're trying to pull this all together. So for me, success would look like when we got ourselves to a place where our members, our citizens, can at least survive for a while in place until emergency personnel is able to get to them if it's necessary. And by the way, the more resilient our communities are, is the more resources it frees up to give people who are maybe more economically challenged more attention and more resources, right? And so that's one of the things that is very important to me. And as we continue to build resiliency across the city of South Fulton, I hope the entire community and the entire city can catch the vision and adapt to what we're trying to do.
We've got some great questions coming in through the chat. Thank you all. Please, if you do have a question, our support from Groundswell are helping us monitor those and curate those for our panelists. So there's a lot of interest in how in the heck are you actually paying for this? And so I'm going to combine two questions, and Matthew's probably best for you to start it. But how have you been able to stack and braid funding to support this work? And you've mentioned, I believe, public, private, state, federal, philanthropic. So there's interest there. And then also, could you explain further the community ownership piece? How is that structured? Like, for instance, is it through a co-op structure?
So the short answer to that first question about how to braid, hard work. But how the Vickers model is structured, it's not a co-op. and we're aware, of the co-op model. But this was an instance in which we were able to bring philanthropic dollars alongside creative financing, which then was also allayed somewhat by the direct pay tax credit, right? And so those three critical components of the stack for Vickers is what made that possible and what made community ownership possible. So the church is now able to receive that reimbursement from the direct pay tax credit that covers a significant portion of the financing that was taken out. And in this case, and this won't happen in every case, that creative financing was also with the portion of that financing that was taken out actually by the battery installer is being granted back to the church as kind of a forgivable loan. And so what that amounted to was that the church was able to secure ownership of the asset with no upfront costs, and then now is responsible for ongoing operations and maintenance, but will be able to also achieve those energy savings on an annual basis, and as Councilman Sebastian said, to reinvest both in its impactful work in terms of food ministry and also to provide some kind of ongoing funding toward the operations and maintenance of the system. So that's how we were able to pull that off with Vickers. And, we really try to take a similar approach, although it won't be identical in every case in other projects.
Council members, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Matthew basically covered it. And again, it was creative. And, it's oftentimes said Vickers was a little bit different in a lot of ways, being the first one, including how the financial stack was put together. So it's not that it's impossible to repeat, but in some of these, it just may be different to put it together.
Yeah, I'll add that this was, we were able to pull this off even within a policy environment that doesn't enable these projects necessarily, right? And we've been able to drive toward community ownership in other locales where, for example, in Baltimore, where we really started this resilience work, where our resilience work started, I should say, where state level incentives really came in to help to drive community ownership. And so we've been able to do that, where you have, again, the kind of stacking, right, of multiple kinds of sources. But one of the things that Michelle Moore, who's our CEO, often says is that the equity gap, especially at the early stages of these projects, pre-development and the like, it has to be funded, not just financed. And so there needs to be, investments, particularly in communities that may not have the capacity, the debt capacity, to be able to pull this off, especially in the most vulnerable communities among us.
Wonderful. Well, on the back end, a question, people are curious to know if you're going to report out about the savings, the performance, lessons learned.
I think that is something that we can and should do in partnership with Groundswell. Again, being that it's the first project, I think as much as we can share to help others learn, which is one of the things that we agreed from the onset, while working with Groundswell, that we're okay trying to be that model and that place where people can come and ask questions as they, go through their own journey in terms of establishing their own hubs.
Yeah, I'll just underscore that by saying that Vickers is not just the first, but it's also become kind of a path maker for others. It's expanded the imagination of folks, especially in this region, around what's possible. And we are early. As you said, the groundbreaking was a year ago. We got from our friends at Georgia Power permission to operate later in the year. And here we are, a few months later, moving forward. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think at the appropriate time, providing feedback on lessons learned, mistakes that we learn from, and guidance for how we might replicate and scale this further in an effective way, that would definitely be forthcoming.
And even its impact on local policymakers or even national policymakers as well. But specifically, the local ones, the mayor of Atlanta was here. The area senator was here. The Congresswoman Nakima Williams, she was here. And so the conversation is starting not only from a national level in terms of this exposure for Vickers and what it can do to help our community, but even down under the dome. I think this year they had a resiliency day or Green Day, something like that under the dome. I saw it when it was already finished, but it tells me that multiple people are now having these conversations around green and resiliency as policymakers, not just out in the communities and with companies and the local government, but even at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
Super. Well, please, if anyone has other questions you want to ask, we invite you to put those into the chat. But back to some of the questions that we had thought about together. I'm curious to hear y'all's responses to barriers that you see communities typically face when they're trying to undertake resilience initiatives, and including Brooke, there's resilience is a core part of just the ethos of Southern Company. What do y'all see, and how do we need to think about those things?
Brooke, I'll defer to you and then I'll jump in.
No.
All right, can we try again?
Yes.
Good. Thank you for your patience. So I would say one of the interesting things that we have learned, especially in storm restoration, is when you are going without, you then decide and identify what is a critical load. So it helps you know, okay, these were the loads that we really needed energy for. And that is something that when we are working with community partners, we want to identify what those critical loads are. And that is part of the conversation when we think about resilience and creating that contingency plan for the future. Access, being able to access buildings continually comes up. And that's something that differs based on transportation, roads, sidewalks. We serve very rural areas and we serve very urban areas. And so that conversation differs based on the community that we're in. And I've worked after major events when there was nothing. And when I was physically working to restore power in that capacity at that time, there was this one event where the houses were completely gone. The road had been pulled out of the ground, and we were just using GPS to identify where a pole had been. And so when there's nothing there, it is always an opportunity to come together. It's always been an opportunity for us to learn what we could do better for the future. And that is something that we are trying to take and proactively plan in these communities for the future. Go ahead, Matthew.
Sure thing. So I'm thinking in terms of the ongoing conversations in local communities around resilience, and especially again in communities that need these resources the most. One of the barriers that we face is cutting through misinformation, disinformation, right? And it's the ongoing engagement that involves education, right, around what this resilience hub is, and what it requires, but then the ongoing implications of it. And it tends to be a less of a lift for anchor institutions that are already externally engaged. However, as you know, there's so many offers being laid at the door of community members, of community institutions, that one of the barriers becomes misinformation that then can breed kind of an initial skepticism. Mm-hmm. And so it requires that we take time and walk alongside our communities, our institutions, and take as long as it takes to make sure that everyone is on the same page and fully comprehends and is fully on board with what it requires, right? And the other thing I would say is that, and this goes also to kind of alignment and engagement, is that the pace of different organizations and different industries are different. And so when you are working, say, with a church, there are deliberative processes in getting things done that are not the same at another type of institution. And so there has to be that kind of patience and alignment and awareness about what it takes to get things done and what our deliberative and governance processes are that ensure that that's also a matter of trust to make sure that all are aligned in the development of these projects.
All right. If I may, yes, Matthew, I'm with you 100%. As a matter of fact, Brooke, I think we had a conversation with some of your colleagues, and one of the things that they spoke about was the difficulty of getting information out that the community would believe in. Mm-hmm. And if we could partner with different things at the church, at Vickers, it more lends a legitimacy to the conversation in people's minds.
Right.
It's legitimate coming from your local power company, but for some reason, people look to the church and they put more, understandably, of a trust in the church rather than sometimes the business community. Resources is a challenge.
Yeah.
And by resources, not only financial resources, but people resources, right? The church operates on mostly volunteer folks, right? And some of the programs that we need to do to not just have the center, but to activate all the other services that can be built around the center.
Yeah.
We need to find partners, and we need to find folks who might be willing to, to help fund some of these things, so that when people give up their time, at least they have an expense account, right? The other thing too is that we have to make sure, speaking from the city's point of view, we have to make sure the right policies are in place, and we have the right laws in place to make sure those don't become a barrier to what we're trying to do. I know recently I've had to sponsor a resolution, for example, around this whole green initiatives and resiliency for the city of South Fulton, right? So those are some of the challenges that we can see that happen at the local level. And yes, the lack of knowledge. People don't understand what a resiliency hub is. They don't understand how they could build resiliency into their everyday lives, so that when they're doing a major renovation in a home, right, that this is something that's at the top of their minds, that they look to either implement or to ask the right questions, so that whenever you have adverse events, they can have a reasonable chance of having a good outcome, an outcome that is not as bad as it could be without some of the things being implemented around resiliency.
Staying in the community engagement lane for a minute, how do you ensure that the community members are not just consulted, but meaningfully involved in the design and governance of the hubs?
I think by giving them feedback and connecting their input directly with the things that are being implemented. Mm-hmm. I think that's a way to do it. Again, at the start of this whole conversation, as I mentioned before, the community identified Vickers, right? And the people who are involved, they listen and they approach us as a church, right? And we see what the results have been, and hopefully we manage to build some things out, even at a bigger and a more sustainable level around that building, as it has been for many years since we've been there in that community. So again, if we can tie directly on the community engagement side what is being implemented and make sure that is then fed back to the community. Hey, you guys said Vickers, so we're here now at Vickers, and not only are we here now at Vickers implementing this project, but we're also going to make sure these other things can be built out to serve you better as a community, right? So it has to be a complete cycle and feedback, and the community might be able to come in and say, you know what, Pastor Early or Elder Sebastian, we would like to see a youth training program around, I don't know, agriculture, right? And we would say, okay, how do we do that? And we would then go and try and find some partners to help us do that, because there's also land around Vickers that can be used as well. And there can be classroom sessions as well as, sessions in the field to establish a community garden, right? So it has to be a complete cycle where the community feels that they're being heard and they see the programming that comes out of the center, and they can benefit directly from those.
Yeah. And to Jaycee's point, there are mechanisms that can be put in place to ensure that, right? So that it's not just a one-off or not dependent on someone making a phone call. But, especially when you begin to build, when you begin to replicate and have, as we're envisioning in Atlanta, an ecosystem, right, of sites that are connecting communities to resilience infrastructure, to build advisory councils, community advisory councils, resilience councils that are local participatory councils that advise and monitor and track and provide feedback, not just on the design of the project itself, but on the ongoing operations and needs, right, as they evolve within a community in relationship to that site. So there are mechanisms in place that can be put in place to ensure that ongoing engagement and meaningful input is solicited and honored.
Awesome. Well, I'm watching our clock. We got y'all for just another 10 minutes. But I want to hear from each of you. If you had one piece of advice for someone who wants to start a resilience hub in their community, what would it be?
You want me to start? I can start. Connect with the right partners.
Yeah.
Connect with the right partners. Do the research, right? Connect with the people who have done this before and have the conversation. Connect with your local government or your local council member or your local senator. Connect with your local church if you're not a church doing this. Is there a place in your community that people naturally look to? If that's not you, then connect with them and figure out if they have either thought of this, share with them the knowledge, share with them some of the things that can be done. And if you need help in terms of passing on more and additional information, reach out to the folks that have done this before.
Yeah. To add to Jaycee's advice, if you have an idea that you want to see a community resilience hub in your community, I would say lean in on community, right? And what I mean by that is I'm thinking about this adage from my friends in the disability advocacy community where they say nothing about us without us, right? And so if you have a vision for what a community might benefit from, it makes sense to ensure that the collective wisdom of the community is represented in the vision, and that we've done the slow, sometimes frustrating work of convening and gathering folks, remembering that it's not just about the infrastructure and resources, it's also about the quality of relatedness between people and the ways in which we've learned to depend on one another, right? And some of that can be fostered even in the process of developing the vision. And so I would say community resilience hubs rely on the collective insight, wisdom, intelligence of communities, and start there, in there, make that the root of all that we do in this area.
No. Well, Brooke, maybe if you wanted to type it in the chat, I'll be glad to read it out for you. We have all been there with the technology challenges, so we regret that you're dealing with that today, but thank you for sticking with us.
Mandy, I had one further thought I wanted to share.
Awesome.
Don't underestimate the value to the business community of building resiliency into their business and their systems. Because again, the more during a crisis a business can keep their operations going, is the less the loss would be to that particular business, right? For example, if for some reason a large power outage were to happen in an area where there, things like stores or pharmacy and places have to close, the company that with built-in resiliency would likely be the one that opens first or would never close, right? So if we can also communicate and partner with the business community to make sure we educate them as to the value of building resiliency every single day into their systems, that would also help them to show them that it's profitable for them to do that, right? Or less of a risk to their bottom line.
Let's try it again, Brooke. Nope. Got it. Now.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know what changed. So I was going to share that as I've engaged in communities, one of the things I've learned is some communities don't always see the utility as a great partner as they're trying to pursue this type of project. And I can't speak for all utilities, and I can't speak for every person. But what I would say is there is a lot of structure as a regulated entity to how we can participate, but that there is a strong interest into finding what that level of participation can be and ways that we can coordinate and collaborate to better serve our customers. Health and safety and meeting that is usually of really strong interest among utilities. And when we talk about, ways we could better serve our customers with our peers and utility meetings. And so I would say that is leaning in on that and finding how we can participate is something I would definitely consider in your region, your area.
Brooke, may I tell a quick funny story?
Please.
Okay.
Because I'm sure it's gonna be great.
So Jayceey and I, on the second day of my time at Groundswell, Jayceey and I were in New York at a gathering where we were presenting the Vickers model and story to a number of folks who are interested in similar projects. Let's put it that way. And Jayceey, you may remember, I got a question from one person asking, so tell me about your relationship with the utility. And I answered, they're a partner. And Jayceey may remember, they actually interrogated me. Their skepticism won them over. And they interrogated me as to whether that was actually true. But we have a testimony about how Georgia Power has been a really important partner in this work. And, contrary to the skepticism of that person who interrogated me, I can attest to that fact. It's a very, very good partnership.
And let us end on that lovely note. I've got our lightning round for you to close this out. What in this work gives you hope? Brooke, why don't you try to go first? No.
Oh, you got it.
Oh,
yes, there you go.
So, it gives me hope when I just enjoy connecting with people and better understanding how we can move forward. And so there's a lot of opportunity for us to find ways to improve the way we serve customers. And that's something we're always interested in. And I will be the first to admit that there's always ways that we can improve. And so finding what that is, working with the community so that as we make those efforts, it is meeting those needs. That's the part that gives me hope when we see that work being done and then hearing that it was effective. So anytime we get that feedback back from the customers that tell us how they were pleasantly surprised, it gives me hope and gives me the drive to keep moving forward and try to find ways to do more.
Awesome. Council member?
Well, for me, it's just the excitement of building a bigger and wider tent for this conversation and this work. I can tell you it for many, many years before I came back to the implementation opportunities that we now have, it seemed a little bit futile, this whole discussion around climate change and its impacts and our adaptation to it. But I think with the funding that has been made available, with the different companies that are now coming onto the tent to have this conversation and spreading it basically not just top down, but bottom up, right? It's a really, really exciting time for us. And I know we face our challenges, but I'm still hopeful that, across different political philosophy and all this sort of stuff, we will eventually cross those barriers. And because at the end of the day, I think we're all interested to making our communities safer, making our citizens' lives better, and making our citizens more prosperous as well. And so once those are our goals, I think this is good work, and I'm excited to not only do this work at Vickers and in the city of South Fulton, but as much as I personally can. I almost talk to everyone that I meet these days about the need to build resilience into whatever you're doing in your own lives, right? That is just the reality. I grew up on an island where, 1 year, I remember we got 6 hurricanes, right? And we were resilient enough, even though we weren't using that word very much, to survive. And not many people, if any, actually died, right, that year, right? So it is possible for us to do this. And we have to really keep driving home that message that the impacts of climate change are here, and you have to take that into consideration. And it's almost as if for us, it's a year-round effort, correct? Because when it's not tornadoes, it's snow and ice, and then hurricane season lasts for a good 6 months of the year. It used to be shorter, now it's longer, right? So this is not something that we can just afford to think about for a couple of days or a couple of months out of the year. This is a life adaptation issue, right? And so even from a policy perspective, I'm glad to be in a position where I can drive some of those discussions and some of those decisions. And then hopefully, even from our little drop, a pebble in the pond, it will stretch out from what we're doing here in Atlanta and around Atlanta and South Fulton to the rest of the state as well.
I'll say very quickly that I'm encouraged and hopeful by what I've witnessed and the ways in which the Vickers Community Center and the broader conversations that it has sparked has really, again, expanded folks' imagination around what's possible. And one of my favorite authors says, transformation in communities toward the world we want to see doesn't happen by critical mass, it happens by critical connections. And what I'm noticing is the ways in which, our conversations are continue to draw in the right partners who may have seemed like they couldn't be further from one another in terms of their interests, but seem now to coalesce around these shared interests and values. And that gives me a lot of hope. Again, represented by folks who are on this screen. So grateful, hopeful, and also glad to be in this conversation with you all.
Hear, hear.
Likewise.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you
your time today. This was inspiring. I'm now going to turn it back over to Autumn with Groundswell.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Thank you so much, Mandy. And thank you to all of our incredible panelists for such an inspiring and thoughtful conversation. And I want to give a really big thank you to everyone who joined us today in the audience. We are so grateful to have you as part of this community, and especially for your great questions in the chat. If today's discussion sparked any connections or ideas, we hope you'll keep the momentum going by joining us in person this November at the Rural Renaissance Roadshow. It's going to be an amazing gathering of local leaders, change makers, and dreamers working to build resilient, thriving communities across the country. You can reserve your spot now at ruralrenaissance.com. I hope to see you there. And until then, take care, and thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. Bye-bye.